Yesterday, the Jets held their first ever press conference with Scott Arniel as head coach. And you know what? There's some interesting notes to be optimistic about. We'll dive into all of that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Stay tuned to hear more about how Game Time can save you time and money on your next ticket purchase. Now, like I said, the Jets yesterday held a press conference. It was the first one with Scott Arniel as part of the head coaching role. He's now taken the mantle on, and this was a good 35 or so minutes with him and Chevy, where you had media asking him questions. You had him reflecting on, not only his tenure as an assistant coach for the Jets, but also some reflection on what happened in Columbus, which was interesting to hear him kind of acknowledge that right off the bat. I think in a lot of ways, people have pointed to Columbus, myself included on one of our previous episodes, as, something of a note of concern. Not that I thought that he was going to be the same coach that he was back then. I think very clearly, in the time since his Jackets days till he took over for Bones this past season, I think it was clear he was not the same guy. And it was interesting to hear him talk about the growth and stuff that he had to go through to move beyond that period, because he said, there were a lot of things that went well for him, in the time afterwards, but that Columbus tenure was very formative in showing him things that he did wrong and things that, he probably wished he could have done and handled differently. But that's all part of the growing process. As a young coach, he really didn't have a great feel for it. I'm sure he drew on a limited pool of experience, and the NHL head coaching role is extremely complicated. It's hard for anyone. And if you don't have like a really deep pool of experience to draw from, and if you're kind of thrown into the waters a little bit, I think that's a really tough spot to be in. So in a lot of ways, I'm not shocked that he struggled. And if you look at Columbus these days, it's a bit of a toxic mess there. I think that there was stuff that was probably outside of Arniel's control, and it doesn't seem like it's really changed all that much in the years since. So, the Jets are kind of an interesting landing spot for him. Under Bonus, I think he got a really good sense of some of the stuff that it really takes to be a coach at this level. And he's shown some interesting growth and some changes that, for me, I was somewhat impressed by. I was a little bit surprised because when he was hired on and sort of indicated to be Rick's natural successor, one concern that I had was, Arniel's kind of like an older school guy, at least on the face of it. So, what kind of head coach would he be? But it seems like he's actually pushing more towards the future. And if his press conference is anything to go by, I'm very intrigued about the way that he sees the future of this organization, because one thing that he really emphasized was the need to move forward to a more data-centric model of building teams, which he said he's a big believer in analytics. He wants to have the organization on the same page. And so that is fascinating. I've made a note for that to be a separate talking point later this episode, because there's more into that he suggested. And I want to sort of break down, what that might mean for the Jets longer term. But just pointing it out now that it's really interesting that he made this a focus of his conference, because previous coaches really haven't talked about it that much. Obviously, Paul Maurice used to talk about analytics to a point, but I think most people understood that when it came to stats analysis, it wasn't really his big thing, right? Maurice tended to be a bit of a gut feel kind of coach, Bones, I think, was definitely more in that vein, definitely a gut feel kind of coach. And he definitely did a pretty good job, but you could tell where there were some clear weaknesses in his tactical approach and sort of some limitations when it came to assessments of player impact. And so what Arniel was suggesting is very interesting because, when you think back on some of the line combinations that he used, some of the players that he relied upon late in games, to me, it was more the kind of decision making that you would perhaps get from some more data centric and data savvy coaching staffs. So that's a very interesting part. Something that, again, I want to talk about a little bit more in depth and how the Jets can really levy that approach a little bit later this episode. One of the other tidbits that came out, though, was that Brad Lauer has been let go. They said it was a mutual agreement to part ways, and I think that is probably a positive thing for the Jets org. I think, both parties probably recognized the power play and special teams really weren't working. And Arniel himself said that he felt like the PK and PP were just nowhere near good enough, and he took responsibility for that. So obviously talking about things doesn't fix it, but I think moving on from that staff and perhaps starting to look at appointing other staff would be a huge thing for this team. Now, Arniel kind of talked about looking to hire 3 or 4 different assistants, whether it's defensive coaching, power play stuff, PK stuff. He did say that he had a list of names that have been given to him, some of which were on the younger side. That to me is interesting because I kind of wonder if maybe Todd Nelson is still on this list somewhere. Obviously, Todd would probably be gunning for an NHL head coaching role, but honestly, if he's maybe a little bit squeamish about getting into the head coaching role almost immediately and would prefer to sort of get his feet wet with like a decent NHL franchise first, I feel like the Jets would actually make a lot of sense in an assistant role. Todd has very limited NHL coaching experience, and the last time he did it, it went a bit south for him. So I think this could be a good chance to, get under the wing of Arniel, who's also kind of learning and growing at the same time. This is a chance where they can honestly experiment with a team that's going to have more emphasis on ELCs if Arniel is to be believed. Hearing that from him, with Chevy sitting next to him was honestly very refreshing. That's a model of success that the Jets pioneered. Well, not really pioneered, but certainly made the most of a few years ago when they went on that cup run. But, they haven't really used it as much since. So refreshing to hear Arniel kind of, say and preach a lot of the right things. And I think that's where this press conference, I thought, left me feeling more optimistic. I know that I've said this in the past about the team, but I feel like when it comes to necessary changes, Arniel, at least on paper and in the press conference, is saying the right things. This is stuff that you don't often hear from Jets coaching staff. I thought that they were very transparent about some of their biggest problems. And, in as many ways as they could say it very gently, they sort of discussed their own shortcomings. And so, for a conference from a team that tends to be pretty tight-lipped about stuff, it was interesting. This is probably one of the most open conferences we've seen, and I hope that it's setting the table for a really big summer, especially because supposedly they're talking about an analytics summit, which is very interesting. We'll have to talk about that a little more and what it might mean for the Jets going forward, especially because, we're in a market that tends to be a little harder to attract talent. So how do you make the most of it? How do you really prioritize signings that add value, right? And I think that is a consistent challenge for the Jets, but it seems like something that they can actually address if they implement a more data-centric approach to team building. But again, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, like I said, just wanted to let you know about our friends and partners at Game Time. Obviously, for those of you who are ticket buyers, you know that you often get hit with surprise fees, and sometimes when you're buying tickets, you're not even sure where you're sitting. Game Time makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer you get to tip-off, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, and guess what? Views from your seat. You always get backed with their lowest price guarantee, event cancellation protection, and so much more to make buying NBA tickets or any other ticket as guest-free as possible. A lot of you have probably seen, Game Time service because you know that they've got great flash sales, zone deals, and all sorts of stuff. But, most importantly, you can actually see where you're sitting. I think that's a really big deal, especially if you're hoping not to be obstructed. I've been to some venues where the seat view wasn't that impressive, and I didn't really know until I actually got there and sat down and realized, yep, view's not so great. Game Time can help you take some of that guesswork out of it, and they make buying a ticket as easy as possible. So take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKED ONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just talking about some takeaways from Winnipeg's press conference with Scott Arniel and Kevin Cheveldayoff earlier. Yesterday, it was a very productive discussion, and one that I think a lot of people honestly should just listen to. I don't always sit through all of their press conferences. Sometimes you get a little bit of like useless stuff, the usual platitudes, but I think the one that Arniel gave with Chevy in particular stood out as something that's honestly worth all of you sitting through. So check it out. It's on the Jets X or Twitter page or whatever you want to call it these days. I think it's actually a pretty good listen and very intriguing. And one of the points that I thought really stood out was this idea of hosting an analytics summit. We'll talk about that in just a moment and why that particular line stuck out. Before we go any further, though, just wanted to let you know, for those of you who are ESPN or Fox Sports watchers, if you find yourself having to turn down the volume because there's so much shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, Arniel alluded to hosting an analytics summit this summer, which I don't know the exact timing of that and when that's going to happen. But the fact that he talked about hosting a summit is very interesting. We've never really heard a Jets coach say anything like this. In fact, usually when we're talking about summits or meetings or whatever, it's usually more in the sort of leadership sense, having like a camp or something like that. To hear Arniel really specifically reference an analytics summit, though, makes me think that he's really intent on adding more data science into Winnipeg's org structure, which is something that hasn't really been a focus for this team for many years. Maurice, when he came in, from all accounts, really modernized the Jets' back-end structure. And so, in a lot of ways, his arrival really did change the Jets and turn them from a more AHL-ish kind of organization into a professional NHL caliber thing. I always hear stories about like basic issues with boxed lunches being given to players rather than like really dietitian approved meals and stuff, higher end catering and that kind of thing, which in most other NHL orgs is pretty standard. But, early on the Jets didn't have that. And so Maurice kind of came in, really redid some of their logistics and stuff, and by all accounts turned them into a more modern NHL franchise, which I think that part tended to go a little bit under the radar, and especially because his NHL exit from the Jets was bad. Let's be real, right? There was stuff that he definitely struggled with, and I think that ultimately, if he had just left a few years earlier, he would have gone out a king in Jets history, but instead, you live long enough to become the villain, and I think that was kind of his story at the end of it. But seems like he's doing okay for himself with the Panthers now. But in terms of like data analysis, that was never really one of his focal points. And certainly Lowry wasn't around long enough for that to be a thing. Bones wasn't really as interested in that either. So for Arniel to kind of really focus on this as something for the future and present, I thought was a very interesting thing that also is probably something that Chevy has thought about. Interesting that Chevy hasn't really pushed for it in the past. I don't recall that really being a talking point with him and his previous conferences. So Arniel kind of leading the charge, I thought, is very refreshing. It's something that the Jets have needed for a long time. And I think when you're talking about a team like Winnipeg that's going to have to exploit market inefficiencies, let's be real, right? The Jets are not exactly the most attractive free agent destination. So you've got to find value in other ways. And that's where having a data science department that can help you find those value signings, find those players who can kind of plug in and kind of become like, I don't know, an Evan Rodriguez or uh, maybe a Carter Verhaeghe, somebody like that, maybe who's a little bit underappreciated at the time, but suddenly finds a groove with their new team because they start getting the right deployments and stuff. I think that could help out the Jets a lot. Winnipeg is not a team that's going to be built out of like top end superstars. That's just not the way that this franchise is constructed, and it's not the way that Winnipeg tends to draft. Right, we're usually middle of the pack, and that means that you're going to get really good prospects, but perhaps not guys like McCarr or McDavid or those generational franchise superstars. We have a couple. We just don't have like anyone up front that I think really matches that tier of player, which is fine. I think there are other ways to build your team to be a winner. And that's where I think the Jets can really make hay by, adopting a more data science driven approach. I think it's something that would really benefit the Jets. I think it would also help the team save money too. Unfortunately, it is going to mean that they're going to have some hard lessons and some hard takeaways. A couple of the guys in the team that are currently contributing probably would not be viewed favorably by some of the science and some of the statistical modeling. And let's be real, you don't always need stats models to tell you who's really struggling. Sometimes you can just see a guy out there and just know that things haven't been going well. And it does lead to tough conversations. And I think in so many words, Arniel kind of alluded to that. He did try and balance it out by saying, data science folks can make a player look X way or Y way based on the data. But like he's being pretty blunt about this, right? There's going to be some players who just look poor on several metrics readings, and that may be an accurate reflection. And I think he was implying that, look, it's going to mean that there are hard choices, and the team's just going to have to make them to get that, what he called like the 10 to 15% better. That was the thing, or maybe it was like 5 to 10%. I don't know, something in that range, right? A marginal improvement that is still statistically significant and enough to move the needle. And that's where he said the Jets really need to get smarter and better about that. So, in terms of checking off all the boxes of what I wanted to hear from a press conference, honestly, this one checked off even a few that I wasn't really thinking about. So, in terms of, not necessarily like blowing my mind or blowing me away, but kind of making me sit and pause for a minute and take some stock of what was being said, I would say that this conference was really good. There was a lot of food for thought. I thought that there was quite a bit addressed in terms of where the Jets have gone wrong and some focus on the future. And I think this whole data science approach, when coupled with the fact that they want to give the kids more runway next season, that's all pretty much what I want to hear. I think now the big question is, how does Chevy respond with the rest of the team? Because, as much as we want to use the kids and stuff, let's be real, right? The team needs, a second line center of some sort. They need a right side defense overhaul. They probably need to change out some of the depth forwards. There's a lot on the shopping list that has to be taken care of, and it's not going to be something that Arniel can fix, right? Chevy's going to have to do some shopping. And, recently I have some degree of confidence in his ability to do so, although the rumors that Winnipeg is really hot to re-sign Sean Monahan do temper that a bit. I like Monahan, and I think he's been good for the Jets, but I think he's not the kind of player that's going to move this franchise forward. I just don't think the fit's there, right? I think Winnipeg needs to be smarter and go faster for what this team needs, right? I think that the speed thing was really a killer in the playoffs. I think it really showed up against Colorado, and we're just going to keep seeing teams like that going forward. I mean, the Stars are a franchise that looks like they're going to be around for a while. That's a problem for the Jets and the rest of the Central Division. The Avs are still going to be there. So, yeah, I mean, if you're Winnipeg, it's time to really start thinking about how to philosophically change this team over into something that's, going from a good, like even great regular season team to being a great playoff team. And that's where, they're still working to get over that hump. But I do think that if they follow this approach that, Arniel is starting to like preach, and if they really commit to this stuff, I think they will set themselves up a good track for the future and really hopefully a brighter overall future. I think that there's a lot that this team can get right with some increased organizational focus on data. I think that's the right approach for what the Jets need. And if Winnipeg continues to really commit to this stuff, look, it's not inconceivable that we end up back into 2017-2018 territory in a couple of seasons. So look, I don't want to like overhype this or oversell this, but I think that there's more to be excited about than there was a few weeks ago. So get ready, Jets fans. We'll have to see what that's like. Now, all of this I think is worth pointing out in the context of one thing, and that's kind of moving on from the past. Obviously, Arniel and a lot of other folks have kind of had to put things aside, take away some hard lessons, and learn how to move on from past mistakes. And I think that's something that really should resonate for the Jets. And I'll talk about why in just a little bit. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just wrapping up some final thoughts after sitting through what was a pretty good press conference from Scott Arniel and Kevin Cheveldayoff. Now is where you have to get to the part of actually turning words into actions, and that's always a bit of a challenge. But on the face of it, right, pretty good press conference, about as much as you could ask for from the first few words from our new head coach. He said the right things. I hope he does the right things. So looking forward to that. But one thing that I think kind of stood out from the overall vibe of what he was talking about was sort of learning from past mistakes and moving on. As a coach who'd been to a point, I think where his own players locked him out of the room at some point in Columbus or something. That's a pretty serious situation, and it really shows that he's come a long way since then. And I think he talked a lot about having to grow as a coach and as a person in the days since. And I think that, honestly has been reflected in what, he's done with the Jets. He's been part of a pretty successful team so far. And it seems like, the players trust him. There's buy-in there. And he sounds like he's more willing to trust the kids too, which, given how he used Ehlers and Perfetti and stuff like that, I'm inclined to believe that's more than just, words. I do think that he's probably going to give the kids a good deal of runway. And if you're a Ville Heinola fan, this is probably the best news that you could have been waiting for. Hopefully, it means that we're going to have a more active, aggressive defense, hopefully a more active, aggressive PK, and a stronger power play overall. But of course, he only controls part of that. So, it's up to the Jets front office to also nail the assignment. And I think Winnipeg really needs to kind of learn from past off seasons where they maybe committed to some models that didn't end up working out. That's okay. You've learned what didn't work. And sure, it might be a little late in the process, but there's still time to right the ship and get yourself into a better position going forward. One thing that I think has kind of haunted the Jets over the years is that they tend to repeat a lot of their same mistakes. Thankfully, they've gotten a bit better about it. We're not seeing as many Wheeler contracts being handed out. It seems like Winnipeg has been more open to using more of their youth and giving them more runway. And it sounds like, there's a desire to genuinely change the process, which is good. The team has kind of been doing a lot of the same stuff, running it back over the last few years. And if the players are finally realizing that it's not going to work out that way, that's great. If the front office has also realized that, even better. I think everyone should be on the same page about the direction and future of this team. And it seems like most people are seemingly on board with the idea of how to move this franchise forward. That is, again, on paper, a good thing. I'm not going to entirely sit here and say that I think Winnipeg has a clear plan of what to do going forward. I think they're still going to kind of wade through things and figure it out over the next few months. But all that to say that I think, like I said, I'm more optimistic about Winnipeg's future than I was initially. I think that there's stuff to like here about the shorter term and longer term implications. I think more so in the longer term, right? This team needs to get back to using ELCs. They need to get back to making really smart signings and trades, and they have a chance to put themselves in a much better spot going forward in this division because, like, the Stars ain't going anywhere. The Preds seem to be improving. Colorado is a really smart and well-run team, so you just don't have that much margin for error. And if the Blues ever sort their crap out, same with Minnesota, again, you're in a really tough division. There's a lot of quality NHL squads here, a lot of really good teams, and they're all really well run. So for the Jets, it's kind of imperative that they follow suit and adopt many of the same tactics and strategies that have helped those franchises become elite contenders. But, for the Jets, they're going to have to do it their own way. There's going to be some things that Winnipeg can and can't do, like those rivals. But you know what? In the areas where the Jets can still make hay, I think they have, at least so far, the right thinking going forward. And hopefully Arniel is really the guy to spearhead that. If he is, then you know what? He was the best hiring they could have made. Somebody who is smart about this stuff, who's more data savvy, and who's really forward thinking, I think is exactly what this franchise needed. I'm hoping that he really lives up to that, because if he doesn't, I think it would be a little bit disappointing. I think it'd be, a bit of a setback for the team. But so far, he is ticking off all the boxes from what I would have asked for from a head coach. I mentioned that Todd Nelson, I was hoping would be a really forward-thinking guy, and it sounds like Arniel's kind of, preaching some of the same stuff that I might have expected from Todd. So overall, the hiring for me, I wasn't quite as down on it as I think a lot of people were. I do think it was kind of like, not ideal on the face of it when you talk about how long the process took and whether or not Arniel had the right inside track. But at the end of the day, Arniel is a guy who's going to do his best, and I think he seems like he's comfortable with the Jets. It seems like Winnipeg thinks he's got some, real chops to him, and that he's ready to help move this franchise forward. And if that's really the case, hey, more power to him. All I can say is I wish him the best of luck, and I'm looking forward to seeing how he coaches for the next few years. This team has a lot of different directions it could go. Some of them are going to be good. Some of them are going to be bad. I think so far, based on some early thoughts and very limited sample sizes that we're working with here, I do think the Jets are going to start moving in a direction that I've kind of been advocating for a while, but now it's just time to see if they can actually sustain it and build a model for repeated success. In terms of getting to the playoffs, the team never really seems to have that much trouble with that, but how they actually turn, regular season success into, deep playoff runs, that's still a bit of a work in progress. And I think the past couple of playoff runs have really shown where the Jets have sort of fallen behind in that particular respect and how they can get back to that point. So a lot of stuff to consider. Obviously, we're going to keep talking about this throughout the offseason. We're still waiting for the assistant coaching staff hirings. That should be coming in the pipeline over the next few weeks, and we'll give our thoughts on that as we can. But for tonight's episode, that is all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow for even more Jets offseason coverage. So, as always, thanks for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.